Hey everybody, Nick here, and today I got a review for you of this little guy right here. This is the Spyderco Vallotton. First off, I want to thank my buddy Adam for sending this guy along. Very interesting knife, glad they've finally gotten a chance to handle one. Then let's do a size comparison. Right here's your Spyderco Delica and your Spyderco PM2, so the Vallotton is not a small knife whatsoever. I mean, seriously, this thing is longer in the blade than the PM2, about as big in the handle, if not a little bit bigger, way thicker than the PM2. By a pretty good margin. I mean, this is a big knife right here. Of course, Ontario rat number 2 and your rat number 1. And so you can see here that blade length-wise, we're in the rat number 1 department, although the entire length is sharpened, which is impressive. And another really big knife that's a little on the murdery side is the ZT452CF. The Vallotton's a little bit more stylish than it is, oh my god, he's trying to kill me, but still, it's definitely a large knife. Note on this guy, the name Vallotton is, it's designed by Butch Vallotton. He's a interesting guy, and this knife actually won Blade Magazine's Imported Knife of the Year award for 2011, which is kind of some interesting history. And there's going to be a mini Vallotton coming here soon, which should be interesting from Spyderco, and kind of spurred me to jump onto this review finally. So there you go. Let's talk about the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of your Spyderco Vallotton. So on the good side, first off, I do like parts of this blade. For instance, the steel is S30V, which is a great steel. It's good to go. And it's got a nice hollow grind to it, which makes a very, very, very thick blade relatively thin, at least immediately behind the edge. That helps very much. There's also an interesting grind here towards the front of it. I'll see if I can highlight it with the light. Yeah, there you go. Where you can see there's kind of a different grind at this neck of the woods. And again, it helps to cut down a little bit on that thickness as you're approaching the tip here. Although it's still a very, very thick tip. But anyways, the blade is interesting and different. It's got this nice long flat portion, a little bit of belly, and relatively shallow blade overall. So there you go. Next thing, this is using a standard Spyderco clip, same clip that you would find, for instance, on a PM2 or something, just painted slightly differently, and it's a 4-position clip, which is interesting. Very often on the higher-end Spyderco Taichung models, you don't see the 4-positional, but this guy is very much so you can do it right side tip up, a tip down, or left side tip up, a tip down. Nice, can't argue with that. Next thing, you'll see that there are full liners here. This is a liner lock knife, and right here you can see that, but the liners go throughout the entire knife, and they're behind the bolsters and everything. This just makes it a fairly beefy knife overall, both in terms of weight, but you can also see if you watch the disassembly, and ideally right here, that they are drilled out a fair amount. It seems like they've really tried very hard to keep the weight down. The balance on this knife is still way far back, at least in my opinion, but at the same time, they've done their best to reduce that weight, so I appreciate that, and the full liners are a good thing. The ergonomics on it are, by and large, pretty good. There's one notable exception we're going to come back to later, which is this little part of the frame lock, the liner lock, but aside from balance being a little weird, this fills the hand nicely. It being a very big, thick knife and having this thumb ramp means that it sits in my hand well. Next thing, this is a relatively complicated looking knife. I mean, you've got 4 screws right here, you've got a bunch more screws on the other side, but practically speaking, it's pretty straightforward to take apart and to deal with. I mean, there's nothing so crazy about the inside of this knife. It's just a little bit fancy, that's all. And so I appreciate that. I was very afraid of taking this knife apart initially just because it looks very complicated, but it's actually a simple thing, which I appreciate very much. It's not tough to deal with. The construction on this guy is very nice as well. I mean, you can tell overall that it's a nice showpiece for the Taichung factory, because it's got the normal good tolerances, the tight fits, great smoothness across the various different parts. I mean, for instance, let's just look at this little back portion here. There are not gaps that you can see between the back spacer and the liner and the bolster, even though I'm not bolster, the scale here. They're not gaps with the bolster either. But you can very much see that these were hand-fitted and nicely done. And this is after a disassembly, so it's not like these are held together just, you know, by one individual factory worker's good graces. So that's very nice. And, you know, the liners and the bolsters and the inlays all match up nicely. nicely. It's a very smooth knife. I mean, this polish on the G10 is nice. It's just, it is a well-built knife. It feels very much that way, and I appreciate that very much. There are also some nice details here. So, for instance, if we look at these thumb studs, we can see these nice concentric circles. It's not something they had to do. They could have gone something a little bit more vanilla, but they didn't. So I appreciate that. And similarly, the maker's mark on this guy brings me some joy. I'll get it in the picture. That's just neat looking. Little snaky guy. Oh, man. Nice maker's mark. The fact that they've got this G10 backspacer that matches the whole thing, and frankly, this entire upper profile is pretty great, because you've got this nice polished black G10 followed by these liners. This knife just looks very pretty overall. Then finally, on the good side, the thumb stud serves as a stop pin. This is not something that's good in and of itself, but it is interesting because Butch Vallotton is actually the first person to do this in the knife community. A bunch of people do it now, but you can see here that these thumb studs go back and then they click against the inside of the liners there in order to lock the blade up. That's neat. That's a very, I mean, it's a nice trick. It's a smart trick. But more importantly is how they've done it here. You can see here that there's a cutout in the internal liners, but not in the bolsters that allow this to happen. Which means that the entire, as you apply pressure down onto the blade, that means that that pressure is not going into these bolsters, which are just held on by the pivot, but they're going into the full liner of the knife, which is also holding the lock. I mean, it's exceptionally well done. You would hope so from the very designer of that concept, but still. There is also this internal stop pin, but that's just to stop the blade when it closes. The blade claps up against that to stop it from banging into the backspacer and whatnot. But either way, it's a smart design, and it's a nice little piece of history. That's where this all started. So, there you go. That's your good. The thumb stud is serving as a stop pin, and that's done well. There are nice details. It's nicely constructed. It looks very complicated, but it's actually pretty simple. The ergos are pretty good overall. It's got these full skeletonized liners, 4-way clip, and the blade has got some very nice aspects. Let's talk about the grade here. To me, what's great about this knife is the style of it. I mean, this is undeniably a very pretty and very interesting knife. This is not something you see regularly. The polished G10 with the bolsters in there and these stripes, and I mean, the entire knife just looks very different. I mean, it's still undeniably a Spyderco. However, it's outside of their normal field. This is a very different and interesting knife, and combine that with the pretty hollow grind, this little blade. This is just a very attractive knife, and it's very unique looking. There's nothing else really out there looking just like it, so I appreciate that. They went outside the mold a little bit, and to me, that's what's great here. Let's talk about what's bad. So on the bad side, first off, unfortunately, I feel like this knife is kind of begging for a detent ramp, because once you put the liner lock up onto the blade, there's another big, strong push to get past that detent ball and to get it up onto the blade itself. It's a little thing, but I feel like it would really improve the experience of owning this knife. But little tiny detail nitpick. A much bigger detail that everyone's aware of, but is that this knife is pretty huge. I mean, seriously, this is not a small knife by any stretch, and so for a lot of people, it's going to be a little bit too big to everyday carry. Not only because the blade is very long, but the knife is just a little too thick as well. I mean, if you look at it, it is way thicker than the PM2, which is already kind of a thickish knife. It's thicker than the Rat number 1 here. I mean, this is just thick, and then finally, it is actually pretty heavy in the grand scheme of things. Come on now. Waiting for my scale. There we go. 6.15 ounces. This is not a lightweight knife, and I mean, why should it be? It's got full liners, it's got a ridiculously thick blade, it's got a bunch of stuff in there. So this is just big and heavy and thick. It's a large knife overall, and it doesn't need to be. Next thing, having this thumb stud there is neat for the history aspect, but it unfortunately kind of interferes with the thumb hole, because as I put my finger up against this thumb hole to pop it open, your thumb is going to be rubbing up against this thumb stud the entire time. It's not a terrible thing. It's not the end of any worlds, but at the same time, that's a little frustrating. I kind of wish that they'd either just gone with the thumb stud and kind of used a little vestigial spider hole as they put on things like the Mantra 2, or that they'd moved it back a little bit and done something a little different there. That's not a great thing. So there you go. Next thing, the thumb hole on this guy does need some chamfering, and in fact, large portions of this knife do. The side of the blade here is very sharp, the top of the spine. I understand that fit and finish gets spread awfully thin at $200, but still, I don't know. Next thing, the thumb studs are actually not that much of a pleasure to use because they are flat, as I'll try and show off here. And they're, right at a 90-degree angle, which means that they're really grabbing at your thumb. I mean, they're definitely workable, but they don't feel stellar on my finger, so little deal. And then finally, this guy is pretty slippery because the majority of the knife is either a semi-polished metal or a polished G10. So, if you're working at the Vaseline factory, this guy is just going to come flying out your hands on a regular basis. You've got a little bit of contouring here, which make it okay, but still, every part of this knife is slippery, so this is really more pretty than it is great for the oil fields. Not that that's a major concern for most people. So that's the bad to me, is that it's slippery, the thumb studs are not so great on the finger, and they interfere with the thumb hole, which itself needs some chamfering. And the knife is pretty huge, it's wide, it's heavy, and it's really begging for a detent ramp. Let's talk about the ugly here. Next thing, the liner lock on this guy is deeply unsatisfying. This is the biggest ergonomic issue because you can see here that the liner sticks up a good amount above the scales, which means you've always got this hot spot off the liner as you're gripping this knife. It's not the end of the world, but it is annoying, and I really dislike disengaging it because you're just pushing your hand against a right-angled piece of... And it just, I just don't get it. And having it being that prominent can mean that in some circumstances, this is what Gail Bradley is concerned about when he really recesses the liners. But, I don't know, I'm not a big fan of that liner sticking up that high. And it's begging for some kind of champ, for some kind of treatment. The liner lock on this drives me nuts. Lockup's fine, though. And then finally, the blade on this guy is just stupidly thick. Not only is the blade relatively, it's not a very tall blade, which means that it's going to be wedged right open to that full thickness, unlike, for instance, the PM2, where there's a gradual going out to the full thickness. It's even thicker than the PM2. I just don't get the thickness of this blade. I do not get why it is this thick. Without the hollow grind, it would be absolutely a mess, but even with it, it's not God's gift to slicing, and if you're cutting into something that provides any resistance, you're going to be wedging open your apples, and that's just not great. And it's making the entire knife thicker than it needs to be, and this knife is already way thicker than it needs to be. In many ways, this blade is just kind of why we can't have nice things in the knife industry right now. I don't understand why this needs to be overbuilt, built like a tank in the blade department. You're not gaining anything, you're losing a great deal. And so to me, that is deeply ugly. This knife needs to have a blade that's half as thick as it is, and it would be a much more compelling knife if it were. But whatever. That's just the decision they've made. So those are the ugly things. The blade is just stupidly thick. The liner lock isn't super well done with it sticking up like that. And then disassembly voids the warranty, which is separately ugly. But let's do final conclusions. Look, this is a neat knife. It's a great showpiece for Taichung's ability to manufacture a nice knife. It's a pretty intelligent design with a couple of little exceptions there. It's very unique. It's very attractive. I mean, there's a lot of good here, and I can see why this could win some awards. And the price on it is actually A-okay. $200 I can live with all day of the week. I mean, nice steel, nice build. It's pretty unique. Oh, no problem there. But the thing is, it has these two big issues, this stupidly thick blade and the liner lock sticking up like that. And because of those two issues, for me at least, in my personal life, this is just a non-starter. It's cool. I'm glad I got to handle one, but I have zero desire to own or carry this guy. My hope, though, is that they're going to address those issues in the mini version. They'll use a more reasonable blade stock, and they'll deal with this in some better way. And particularly, it's also going to be a little bit smaller, which is, well, something this could use. That's something I can't wait to check out. But the thing is, for this guy right now, if you can live with those two issues, it's a fine choice. It's a very nice knife. It's not badly priced, and frankly, I'm sure it's going to be valid in your EDC. Yeah, didn't see that one coming. Anyways, no, I mean, seriously, it's a nice knife if you can deal with those things, but I sure as heck can't. There you go. Hope this is interesting and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.